Hello, everyone. My name is Amy Miller, and I'm the president of the PhRMA Foundation. And welcome to today's webinar on crafting clear, compelling research aims. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. David Veenstra from the University of Washington. I learned of Dr. Veenstra's work while I was a lobbyist, and so used some of his earliest research in the economics of pharmacogenomic testing as a lobbyist. So let that be a warning to all of you scientists. You too may have your research discovered and used by a lobbyist. The PhRMA Foundation values you. We want to fund you. We seek future researchers and leaders in the fields that we fund. Our mission and vision and values are listed here. And while David served on our Value Health Outcomes Committee, what he's going to talk about with AIMS does apply to every category we fund. So outside of VAHOR, we also fund translational medicine, drug discovery, and drug delivery. And I'll tell you, when the committees review the grants, they focus a lot on the aims and their realistic nature and if they're well described. So this is a very important topic. We fund pre-docs, postdocs, and early career faculty in those categories, and you can see the stipend levels here. This is just the next in a webinar series, and I've highlighted two here that I also think are particularly valuable. The first is tips for writing a winning grant application by Peter Newman, and you can see we've got some hot takes from his presentation, and then how to write a letter of intent by Dr. Stephanie Watts, and then her LOI do's and don'ts checklist is also on the screen. I should tell you that there's a lot of information in this webinar, and since you've registered, you will receive this webinar in your mailbox by the close of this week. And all of our webinars are on our website, of course, but they're also on our YouTube channel, which is simply PhRMA Foundation YouTube channel. So if you think of this 6 months down the line and want to reference it, we're easy to find. With that, I'd like to ask my guest speaker, Dave Veenstra, to join us. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Amy. Thanks for the invitation to talk today, and hoping to kind of distill some of the things that I've learned over the years working on research proposals and writing specific AIMS pages, both with collaborators, writing grants, working with graduate students, and also reviewing proposals as part of the PhRMA Foundation review committee for health outcomes. Some of, I'm going to talk at a pretty high level, kind of a general level. I think it's applicable across different fields. Those of you working with mentors, et cetera, you'll hear input from them about the styles that they like to see, and you need to listen to them because there are different ways to approach this. So don't take what I tell you as gospel. It's not the only way to do it. It's just the things that I've learned from the great folks that I've worked with over the years. I just wanted to kind of mention briefly some of the training materials that are already up on the PhRMA Foundation website, and one in particular from a colleague of mine, Peter Newman, who's a health economist at Tufts. And he had a very nice webinar on how to write a grant application. And next slide just covers some of the things that Peter talked about. And Peter's an excellent writer. He's well known in the field. And so I'd highly recommend listening to his webinar. And these are just some of the tips that he had. And I'll come back to these again in my talk. Make reading easy for your reader. Okay, they're busy. Get them excited. Be clear. Talk about how your work builds on previous work or existing work or the work that's been going on in your mentor's lab. Talk about how your work's going to impact the field. Okay, so they kind of have a sense of all this as they're getting into exposure to your idea. You need to be very specific about your approach, and always working with new trainees, always come back to that. Be specific. Be specific. Do not make general statements. The chances are your audience is going to know that already. Don't be hand wavy, vague about what you're going to do. You need to make sure that what you propose to do is feasible. So you need to convince the reviewers that you can achieve those goals. The timelines, number 7 there, be realistic. It always takes longer than you think, especially if you're just getting started in the field. And if you're applying to the PhRMA Foundation in particular, go read all of the information about what are their priorities, what are they interested in, what's their focus, make sure you're responsive to those things. And then Peter, next slide, also had some tips about just kind of the process, and I'll touch on some of these things about knowing your audience, make the reviewer's life easy. Letters of support from different folks are important, both those who are close to you as well kind of at the institutional level. Any folks you have involved, collaborators, make sure that they're not just window dressing, that there's a good reason why they're involved, etc. And then follow directions. And you'd be surprised. This sounds simple, but I hate to admit it, but I myself, as well as friends and colleagues of mine, have put in months and months of work, submitted stuff, and then realized, unfortunately, we made a mistake. And sometimes it's something incredibly small, such as you're not allowed to include certain extra documents, and you do that. I don't think I've ever gotten in trouble for a page limit, although we once underestimated the page limit. So you really have to be careful about that. You get so focused on your science and your ideas. All right, next slide. So those are some general conceptual levels. And what I want to talk about is this thing called specific aims, or the specific aims page. And I'll go through an example of a specific aims page that we wrote. And it's a one-pager, those of you who aren't familiar with it, and it conveys your research idea. And a lot of people get focused on, okay, I've fully formed my idea. I know exactly what I'm going to do. Now I need to write it down, and it needs to be beautiful. I do not view specific aims pages that way, and I don't think most established investigators do. They're really, it's a process where they evolve over time, and they help you refine your research ideas or questions. Okay, so I'll talk about that a little bit in general before we get into specifics. Next slide. So again, it is a one-pager. It is with the vast majority of places that you're going to go for a research funding, where it's peer reviewed by some kind of review committee. It's the standard in the field, really, to have this one-page overview description of what you propose to do. And it's standalone. So you can hand someone that single page, and it will give an entire overview of what you propose to do. So that's what it is. And I believe it has multiple uses. So we'll talk about that. Next slide. So it's really a place to put ideas on paper. It is a one-page limit. I'm a stickler for this in particular, and a lot of the people I work with are too, because forcing yourself to stick to one page really forces you to think about what really do I want to do? What methods, what is the key approach that I'm going to use? And so I think really trying to force yourself to that one-page limit is important, particularly as you get farther on. It will creep over one page, and you always got to cut it back a bit. And then really it will evolve many times. And when I say 5 to 10 versions, I don't mean 5 to 10 versions of like the text and editing. I mean 5 to 10 versions of like, what is it we're going to do? What are our aims? And so you can have substantial, meaningful changes. If you were to actually track how many times a specific aims page is edited, like word changes and stuff, I mean, it easily be 100 times. So this thing gets tweaked a lot, and it's kind of your reference point throughout your whole journey of writing a proposal. One of my key number one things I always tell the people, don't hesitate to get started. And I don't know, as someone who does get writer's block, I know it can be hard to get started, but I see people, especially early in their careers, they're afraid to start writing down their ideas. And I think it's a feeling that, well, it needs to be fully formed. It'll be judged. Or frankly, maybe you don't really know exactly what your idea is. And I would just say that's okay. Just start writing stuff down. And it's a good way to get rolling. But that said, the final version that goes into your grant proposal has to be a beautiful work of art. And we'll talk about that. All right, next slide. Thanks. So there's a few things you're trying to do with your specific aims page, and people have different approaches to this. There's different outlines that at the end of this webinar, I have a few references you can go check out. This is generally what I try to do and what people have told me to do or taught me to do. And the first thing is really, why do we do research? Okay, it's because you're trying to figure something out. There's something that's not known. There's a problem. Okay, work needs to be done. And that's really, getting that up front is really important, because the reviewer will quickly be oriented in terms of what's going on. And I think it helps you refine your research idea. And then secondly, okay, you've got this problem. Well, what is it you're going to do? What's your general approach? And give me, as a reviewer, like, give me a feeling of why is this approach good? I need just a tidbit on that. If I'm familiar with the field, familiar with the methods, I'm going to know that already. But you'd be surprised. Don't ever assume that your reviewer knows exactly what you know. They may be unfamiliar, and so make sure that they know that. You do want to tell them, I feel a little bit about who you are, and that's like one sentence, maybe 1.5 sentences, maybe 2 sentences. It's real brief, but just give them a sense of, look, this is who I am, this is the training I've had, this is the lab that I work in, etc. So they have a sense of that. This is what I've done in the past. I know a lot of you probably don't, just getting started, can't refer back to a ton of previous work you've done, but you can refer to things, the training you've had and the areas that you're familiar with, as well as the collaborators and mentors on your proposal, what they've done. Then generally I like to come back and say, hey, what's your overall goal? And I think sometimes people state this, sometimes they don't. I like this statement. We'll come to talk about it a little bit more. It kind of pulls back and looks at the big picture. And then we get into the specific aims, and I'll talk more specifically about those. And I think sometimes someone taught me this, and it was one of the most valuable things I think I learned. And it was, don't tell me what you're going to do. Tell me what you want to learn. And it really kind of made a lot of things click in my head every time I write a grant. And those will be your aims. And how are you going to do that? What are your hypotheses? And then lastly, how are your results going to be used? Like, what are the implications? Next slide is really just, how do we go about doing this? And again, we're going to go through a specific example. And generally, this is how things are laid out, step by step, as you work through your specific aims page. Next slide. So just some tips here. Again, I'll come back to this, but don't tell me that you're working in a certain kind of cancer. Don't, kind of like, if it's a common cancer or something, don't tell me that it's a terrible disease and it costs a lot of money. I know that. Okay, as your audience, there's like a 99.9% chance they know these things. If it's a rare disease or something they may not be familiar with, you might need a sentence to give them background, but very quickly get right to the point. Less background, more problem. Your general approach, I mentioned generally what you're going to do, not gory details, but your general kind of your field of approach, your general kind of conceptual approach, and why it's helpful. Again, who are you? An overall goal. Again, big picture. It helps you transition into your very specific aims. Next slide. The aims, again, this is what you hope to learn. Your aims are not your methods. And then a little description of underneath each aim. How are you going to do it? What are your hypotheses? What data sources are you going to use? And then how would your results be used? And again, don't restate your methods. Don't restate your aims. Talk about, hey, I produced my work. I published a paper. Why would anyone read it? What are they going to do with it? And it might be to help advance a certain area of research. It might be to inform some kind of policy decision, etc. Okay, next slide. So just to come back to this again, people start to get wrapped up in the words and the writing, and just reminding you that the specific aims page is a tool, and it really helps you organize your thinking. A lot of people think that they know what they want to work on or what the problem is, but until you start writing it down, only then does it really become more clear to yourself. And then also taking that specific aims page and showing it to your mentors and collaborators. And again, I can't emphasize enough, don't try to write some perfect or even like good looking specific aims page. Just get it on paper and start using that to communicate to folks. And then once you've worked through, as you're working through, say you get a specific aims page that looks really good, you're like, oh, this is pretty much final. I'm going to start working on, now I'm going to go write the rest of my proposal, which oftentimes is maybe 12 pages. You'll find you'll work through your proposal and you work on that for a month or so, and you'll come back and you'll read your specific aims page and you'll be like, oh, wait a minute. That's actually not what I want to do, or that's not what I'm doing. And you'll tweak your specific aims page. So it kind of provides, again, an outline, a reference point for you. And then lastly, of course, ultimately, it's a communication piece, and it is the thing that reviewers will read. Grant applications can be like all the documents in there with your CV or et cetera, your biosketch. I mean, they can be 50 pages, they can be 500 pages, but that specific aims page is the single most important page in there. So it has to be looking good. Next slide. All right, I want to just mention this because as you're using the aims page as a tool to formulate your ideas. When I remember my first year in a postdoc, I heard this in class, the question is, what is the question? And, at the time I was like, this is silly. What? Of course, that's a silly thing to say. But honestly, I keep coming back to that every time I start talking about a new research idea with folks. And that really is the most important thing. It's like, what is it you're trying to address? What is the problem? And again, the specific, you're trying to come up with ideas. So next slide, really, the aims page helps you do that. And that's, you have this initial idea. You might have a general area you want to work on. You think you have a question. And I would just say most of the time, the truth is there's probably 5 or 6 or 7 questions within there, and you need to figure out which ones you want to go after. And the aims page helps you do that. And you just go through this cycle or this circle of revising it as you go through. And look at it. Aims come and go. You might change the number of aims. You might completely throw some away and add new ones. That's okay. That's totally fine. Next slide. And it's even okay if I've worked on a specific aims page for a couple months and then some new idea kind of comes out of that, and like almost like literally throw that original aims page away because our team's decided we're going to go pursue a related idea that popped out of all the discussions with that first aims page. That's okay too. Obviously you don't want to go in circles the rest of your career, so you have to be strategic about how you do this. But without kind of this structure and process and having it documented, it's easy to get lost in this process, talking about all these different ideas and things you might do. Next slide. Okay, I wanted to make things a little more concrete. Pardon me, and show you an actual example. And this was a specific aims page from a proposal that I wrote with some collaborators to the NIH. And we wanted to kind of try to better understand what the clinical and economic outcomes might be of using a prediction algorithm using genetic information, a polygenic risk score, or PRS, using that clinically. What might be the outcomes of that, and might it be cost effective or not? So this is basically just to stratify people into different risk groups and say, hey, people that are higher risk, we should do things to help prevent future disease in those people, more intensive screening, et cetera. Now we're going to use some techniques that are used in the health economics and outcomes research field called decision analytic modeling. So it's basically a simulation model. And our target audience in this particular case is an NIH study section. And I don't have, it can be very complicated figuring out who's going to review your proposal. If you're going to NIH, you can suggest study sections. The study sections, the individual people that are on those groups of reviewers changes over time. And then, I'm telling you, who's on that committee, what day of the week it is, it can influence kind of how they view proposals. So you have to kind of really, for younger investigators, it's harder. That's why you rely on more senior investigators. Now, PhRMA Foundation you have a pretty good idea of the group of folks that it's going to go to, kind of what their skill set is. And in this case, it hopefully will be kind of in the area that you're working. But you need to realize that you're not writing to some generic kind of body. You're writing to individual people, and knowing who those people are and having some sense of what they funded in the past is super important. And you can look up, like, for federally funded stuff, you can go, every single federally funded project in this country is public. The specific aims, kind of the abstract of it, is publicly available. So you can get a sense of what's been funded in the past. And that's really important. So these size of these committees, they can vary depending on your funding agency, but they can be as small as 4 or 5 people, but I don't know, 10 to 15 is not unusual. It's pretty normal. In this particular case, the study section definitely had strong background in genomic medicine. It was not a health economics group, so we had to be careful in explaining what we were doing. And then also, for those of you that aren't familiar with the review process, at NIH, most places, it's very common where you have like primary, secondary, tertiary reviewers, and they read your proposal in depth. Those 3 reviewers, for example, and the primary reviewer has the most responsibility for knowing the most details, and then presents your proposal to the entire committee and gives their assessments of the strengths and weaknesses. And then the secondary reviewer weighs in, as well as the tertiary reviewer. And then it gets discussed among those reviewers and the entire committee, and the entire committee asks questions, et cetera. And then those other committee members may have read the entire proposal. And then it's discussion back and forth. And it happens very often where sometimes certain reviewers feel that it's a very strong proposal, and other reviewers may have some serious concerns. And so you need to realize you need to provide the material, the ammunition, the clarity for the reviewers to make those arguments, and hopefully the arguments in favor of supporting your proposal. So make their lives easier. That's how it works. Next slide. So what I want to show you right here is this is an early draft of our specific aims page. I was working with my collaborators, Josh Peterson at Vanderbilt and Jing Hao at Geisinger Health. And I just went into my files and I think this is the earliest version I found. And you can see here that this is just a draft. Okay, there's I think Josh might have started this, and we're just kind of writing out, look, this is the request for applications we're responding to, and in part that was just to kind of orient us. And here's our aims. We have 4 aims. Aim 3 has 2 sub aims. There's not a lot in the beginning. There's not a lot in the end here. We're missing parts. These are just initial ideas. And you can see Jing, this is the particular time point where Jing was going through it and saying, hey, what are we doing? What are we doing here? What are we doing here? And this is what it looks like. And you go through many revisions of this. So the next page, next slide, shows you the final. I think this is actually, I'm not 100% sure it's the final, but it's essentially the final version of our specific aims page. I know you can't read this. We're going to go through this text line by line, essentially. But what I wanted to show you here was, when I'm done with a specific aims page or close to it, I want it to look appealing. Not reading, not able to even read the words, just kind of the density of the text, not too dense. There's some white space there in between paragraphs. There's some use of bolding, not too much, some use of underlining, potentially not too much. And just kind of like a nicely written, laid out specific aims page should kind of have a certain feel. Now, people have different styles, but super dense, nothing but text, no spacing. As a reviewer, I hate that. It's hard. It's harder to consume that information. You don't want to waste space. You can see how there's indentation on the aims, and people kind of have slightly different styles on that, but the aims kind of pop out. The detail under the aims are kind of clearly laid out. What else do I want to mention? Short paragraphs. this might be a pet peeve of mine, but I seriously dislike long paragraphs. They are just, it's harder to consume the information quickly and clearly. So don't be afraid to write a 2-sentence paragraph. Don't get scared about it. Okay, that's it, I think, on the overall view. Next slide. So this is just going through some of the specific wording, and I'm going to comment like, oh, here's an example. But also when I reread this, I was like, oh, I might rewrite this a little differently in retrospect. But so the key point here is like the text highlighted in purple here is really stating what is the problem. Okay, and here we're saying like if we don't have some good evidence about what's likely to happen with the outcomes of these prediction tools, we really could run into some troubles with adoption and kind of population health impact and economic impact in the US. So we get to we're pretty blunt about it, that this field may not move forward without this understanding. I don't know, that's a little grandiose, but I think it's realistic. Looking back at this, the only thing I would say is that first sentence about what like PRS, like looking back, we did not need to have, I don't think we needed that sentence. That whole study section, I can't imagine any of them didn't know what polygenic risk scores were. In the first sentence, I want to mention the words polygenic risk score. I'd probably just incorporate it into that second sentence. So that might be some tweak that I might make to improve it. You can see there's also a little bit of gray bolding there about it is unlikely the long-term value, blah, 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 can be determined experimentally. And this is really just telling them like, we're probably not going to have these huge randomized controlled trials because of the size and the duration of follow-up that would be required. So really kind of laying out, look, there's a real problem here. Okay, next slide. And here we say, look, this is what we're going to do. We're going to use this thing called decision analytic modeling. Anyone in our field is going to know immediately what we're doing. But I know the majority of people on that study section probably either didn't know what it was or weren't that familiar with it. So we had to lay that out pretty clearly. I think next slide, I've kind of refined that by knowing our audience, we've explained, look, this is what decision analytic modeling does. This is what the advantages are. Okay, so making sure that they have a sense of what this approach is. Really important. Next slide. Okay, this is a little bit of the who we are and what we do. Now I just got to be frank. This was easier for us because we'd had a previous grant. We worked together for 4 or 5 years together on a similar topic. So it was not that hard for us to kind of lay this out, but it was important and valuable, I think. And if you're a younger investigator, again, I think people can find this hard to write, but you've got training and you're working with other people. And I think briefly talking about that is really important. If you're writing a pre-doctoral, postdoctoral, or young investigator award, you are working with other folks and more senior folks, and you can kind of talk about that setting and your training and any work that you've done. For those of you who are in lab-based work, you'll hear from your mentors and stuff talking about preliminary data. And that's really about, you get in your full proposal, you'll get into details about that. But reviewers want to know that, hey, this is a good enough idea to pursue, and you're capable of doing it. So that might be something that's mentioned briefly or alluded to in this statement. Okay, next slide. Again, I like to always kind of come back to this. You kind of said, what's the problem? What's our general approach? This is who we are. And I like to come back to this. Hey, what's the overall goal? And a lot of times I find this statement a little hard to write, but I find it valuable because I think it helps you pull back and look at the big picture again before you start getting into all of your gory details. And it also, I think, the reviewer's kind of like, okay, I kind of got the situation. What's going on in this grant? Boom, 1 sentence. It's like, okay, I got it in my head now. What's happening and why? Tell me the details. Next slide. So this is where we get into the aims. And I would say one of the most valuable things someone ever taught me was they said, your aims are not what you're going to do. Your aims are what you hope to learn. And I've seen, I don't think aims are always written that way, and I don't even always write them that way, but I think they really work better that way. Your aim is to learn or understand something. And then you describe how you're going to do that. So next slide. Here we talk about, look, these are the method and approach that we're going to use. So you can talk about methodologic, not details, but approaches, study design, conceptual approach, data sources. Okay, those are the kinds of things that you want to talk about here. Next slide. All right, this is where you put your hypothesis. We didn't state a hypothesis here. We had them. We had some very interesting hypotheses. They didn't fit in here. We had a lot going on. If we couldn't really state every hypothesis we had, but looking back on this proposal, if I was to go through it again, I think I'd try to pick out the aims or sub aims where we had very compelling, interesting hypotheses and state them. Like, this is what we think would happen. Now, in this particular technique, simulation modeling, we don't do kind of traditional statistical hypothesis testing. You don't have to do statistical hypothesis testing to have a scientific hypothesis, okay? So what is your scientific hypothesis? And it really does help, I think, again, orient yourself and the reviewer in terms of what it is you're trying to accomplish. All right, next slide. Another thing is you're working through all this stuff. How do all these ideas fit together? Now, it's nice if your aims kind of build on each other. They should be somewhat related, but generally having them build on each other really makes for a compelling case, but you have to be careful. The fatal flaw in some proposals is that, like, if aim one, quote unquote, fails, you can't do aim two because it was 100% dependent on aim one. So you have to be careful. You have to structure in a way that, you do want to take some risks. I think PhRMA Foundation proposals, they do want kind of groundbreaking, risk-taking stuff, but you do need to be honest and say, hey, if this doesn't happen, what am I going to do? And somewhere in your proposal, even if it doesn't quite fit into your aims page, usually when you're writing out a proposal, one of the last things you should do when you're describing a certain aim is at the end of that description of the aim, you should say, hey, what are other approaches I could have used? Why didn't I use them? And then B, like, what happens if we find this or that? What happens if this doesn't work? What am I going to do? So there's a place you can kind of, I would say, protect yourself and explain to your reviewer, hey, this aim doesn't work, or we get result B when we expected A, we can still do stuff with that. Yeah, okay, that's good. Next slide. And then again, just the summary statement. It doesn't look that complicated. In a way, it's not, but I've just seen so many proposals where people just restate what they're going to do. You've already told me that. You already told me what methods you're going to use. So try to really think about, how will your results be used? What are the implications? And I know that you don't know what you're going to find yet. But whether, quote, positive or negative, those results, it's science. Those will be helpful for somebody. Okay, next slide. So that's kind of like my big picture overview. That's kind of some details and some specifics. There's just to wrap up, there's a lot of wonderful resources out there. Here's a few of them. There's three links there. One is to this bioscience writers. I'm actually not too familiar with exactly who they are, but I am familiar with this. They've written a thing called the Anatomy of a Specific Aims page. A lot of folks reference it, and they kind of talk about, as I have, the structure, each paragraph, what you want to achieve in each paragraph. And again, people have different, kind of slightly different approaches and styles. My general approach is don't try to do too much in each paragraph. But it's good to talk to different folks and read different things. There's something from the NIH here. And then there's actually a publication. Some folks kind of outline stepping through a specific aims page. So utilize those resources. Your best resources are going to be other folks that have written specific aims pages. Okay, so reach out to mentors, collaborators, etc. Next page. So just to kind of recap here, do not hesitate to get going on your specific aims pages. I've sat down, and speaking of writer's block, my personal technique sometimes is just keep drinking coffee until I start writing something. But I've sat down and just had 3 separate paid specific aims pages because I didn't quite have a handle on what I wanted to do. And I just wrote 3 totally different drafts with pretty different aims. That's where I started. And each one had 3 sentences on it as an aims page. It's okay to start like that. Do not be afraid to share this with folks. They're going to give you great feedback. I share every specific aim. I think I've shared every specific aims page I've written closer to a final draft with people that are not in the field of science at all. And that's a judge of like, do you at least have a sense of what I'm doing? And I get excellent feedback and I make changes based on that. So don't be shy about that. Revise. This is something Peter mentioned, be concise. I have worked with individuals who literally go through every single word on that specific aims page and they cross it out and they say, do I need that word? Can I get away with it? Getting rid of it. It's actually a good technique, a good approach. Don't waste words. You're wasting your reviewer's time. And that's kind of gets to my 5th point. Make their life easy. We're not talking today about the full body of the proposal, but again, that's a place where be very careful with your organization, be well organized, don't have super dense text or paragraphs, have good spacing, indentation, have nice figures that aren't too tiny. Yeah, for anything for the main text, figures, some tables that aren't too dense. Those are all the kinds of things you can do to make reviewers' life easier. Okay, next slide. So I just thanks for your time, and just thanks to all the mentors I've had and colleagues over the years. Everything I told you, I've learned from them or working with them, and even some of those wonderful reviewers that have given me such nice comments on proposals. And I think, as Peter mentioned, I've written way more specific aims pages and proposals that have been funded. So don't get discouraged. It's a numbers game. You just got to keep at it and keep learning as you go. So Amy, I'll hand it back over to you now and see if
Fantastic.
we have any questions or the interactive part of the webinar.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for those great remarks. I learned some things, and we will go to the Q&A. So if you do have questions, please type them into the Q&A block and I will get to those. Before I get to Q&A, though, I do want to make some points and reiterate some points already made. De-wording is important. This should read like a short story. When you were in school, you were taught everything in a short story is meaningful. This is the shortest story that you're going to write about your research. So think of it that way. And we just had a review meeting where, unfortunately, because aim 1 would fail, or if aim 1 failed, the rest of the aims were dependent. Those studies were not selected for funding. And I'm talking about one of the bench sciences. So that is extremely important, but aim 1 can fail. You have to just have a backup plan for if it does. Same if aim 3 is dependent on aim 2. So just make sure you write in there what you will do if an aim fails. Have others read it. I think some of the most successful applications are read by someone who isn't in the science. And that's especially true, for example, the aims page or your personal statement. It just makes it more clear. With aims, don't be overly ambitious, especially those of you earlier in your career. When we see a pre-doc application with 3 tough aims, we just wonder how realistic they are, and often caution that they're not. And this committee, the one David served on, they've often awarded awards and wrote in their message back, please only tackle aim 1 or aim 2. There's no way you're going to get to aim 3. Good luck. So I just wanted to reiterate the realistic nature of aims is also important. And then finally, one of the questions that came to me, and I'll pass back on to you, is the target audience for the foundation. So in your example, you knew it was an NIH genomics group, so you knew what they didn't know. our reviewers are posted online, but as you know, it's a large group of people. So it's in the 20s, and no respondent's going to know who's going to be the first and second reviewer. All of ours are reviewed by 2 people. So what is your suggestions? How do they frame up the target audience when they're applying for a foundation grant?
Yeah, I mean, it's wonderful that the reviewers are, available, that people can see who they are. Now, the composition for your particular review might be slightly different, but you get a really good feel who's there. So that's really wonderful. But even, when you have that many people, not everyone knows everything. And it is a little bit of a fine line. You don't want to tell them things that like everyone already knows, but a fatal mistake is to not explain something. And the reviewer themselves, the primary reviewer, to not, I have been in that situation as a primary reviewer where I'm like, I kind of get what they're doing, but this isn't my particular expertise, and it's harder and it makes me less comfortable. So really, certainly, if not in the specific aims page, in the main text, it only takes 1 or 2 sentences to give people a feel. And that's the kind of thing you need to do when thinking about your audience, and who you're targeting to. And again, just to, people will have different viewpoints. And sometimes a reviewer that's in support of your study will be having a discussion with someone who's concerned about your study. Make sure those little bullet points are in there, those key points about why is this a strong study. Within the main text, I didn't mention it on specific aims page, but really you should have a sentence in there about why it's innovative. And that's probably something that should have included, because in the main text, and NIH wants this, why is this innovative? Why is this a cool study? And those are the kinds of things that help your target audience, regardless of who they are. So
absolutely. And when somebody is expert, they have looked at vague aims pages and had said things like, well, I assume they mean this, but they didn't say it, so I can't know for sure they know these things. So vague aims are also not good.
Right.
Okay, so we do have some questions. First is a compliment, great material and direction, so kudos. Second, any comments on the use of images? Are images often in aims pages? I can't honestly remember.
I don't know if is that a comment specifically about aims pages. If it is, and if you mean figure or image, I would say you don't see them that often. I saw one, I liked it, and I did it once. I put a little figure, and it was how the aims relate to one another on my specific aims page. And it took a little bit of guts to do it, but it worked. I think the reviewers liked it. So you can consider it. For first timers early on, I think I'd probably not do that. I think it can be tricky to do it.
Good. Next up, let's see. What are your recommendations for using acronyms appropriately? I've had many people comment on, I use too many acronyms in my specific aim, so it's difficult to follow, but sometimes it's hard to avoid. Any advice?
Well, this is from anonymous attendee, so AA
Yeah.
could mean a lot of things. It's an excellent question. There's no great answer. Don't use more than 2. How's that? Like, you got to be careful. Like for us, we talked about polygenic risk scores, PRS. We defined it. We knew that our audience knew what it meant, but you need to be very careful. In the text, at some point you have to use acronyms also, but be very careful, especially in the specific aims pages. And a lot of journals, for example, won't allow acronyms unless they're well accepted in an abstract. And there's a reason for that. So honestly, I know it's hard, but if you're using that same word, 4 or 5 times, you're probably going to have to use an acronym, but be careful.
Especially if somebody who's not expert in your field is reading it, they may have to reference what all the acronyms are in the first mention, and that's a disadvantage if they have to keep referring to that. So use caution, I think, is a great answer. So how does PhRMA Foundation assure the confidentiality of the proposals? Well, we make our we make our reviewers swear to confidentiality when they agree to be reviewers. Also, we ask reviewers to disqualify themselves. So for the last time David served on our committee, I think he was out of the room for an hour and a half because we discussed all the University of Washington and he was conflicted on all of them. That's, I think, the best we can do to protect confidentiality. Let's see. Good presentation. What steps would you suggest we take next when the grant is triaged? So I'll start. PhRMA Foundation hasn't always given feedback. They're starting to do that, but it requires the reviewers to put in comments for us to send back to you. So if you have failed at receiving one of our grants and you want to reapply, I strongly urge you to do that. However, I just wanted to let you know that we can only send feedback if we ourselves get it in the grant portal, but over to you.
So like for NIH, you can, if those first 3 reviewers read it and you don't get a very good score, it doesn't even get discussed in the whole committee. So that might be what you mean by triage. So, and then, or it may get discussed at the whole committee, and then you would only get comments from each reviewer, or it might get discussed at the whole committee. It still may not be funded, but you'll get overall comments from the committee discussion. I would say 2 things. If it, if you get a decent score, if it does get discussed at the whole committee, take the comments to heart. You need to make serious changes, make them. Okay, you're going to, I've done this, waste your time refining stuff. If it doesn't even get discussed, you need to give serious consideration to dropping, like taking one piece out of it maybe and running with that. But I've done that, didn't get discussed. I submitted again, didn't get discussed. So at some point, don't be afraid to kind of let go of things that don't seem to be working. Usually it's not the whole thing, it's one piece. And so listen to the reviewers, but you also need to be cognizant. Sometimes you just get a grumpy reviewer or someone that just doesn't like the general approaches you use. And you have to kind of take that into consideration. That's where you need senior kind of experience to judge that. Yeah, so good question. And that's more for NIH where there's kind of more complex levels of feedback.
Absolutely. So the next is for me, I think, should we write PhRMA Foundation grants in the same direction as the NIH? We know that we get early career researchers sending us R01 applications. It's very obvious that we're getting NIH level applications, and that is okay. Our grant application process is built off the NIH because it was built by people who served on NIH review committees. It's a little more streamlined, it's a little less onerous, but it is intentionally designed to mirror it. Let's see. Many times I get comments who most likely were not in the field of my research proposal. How do we assign reviewers? It's keywords. And so every reviewer fills out a keyword table, and then every applicant fills out keywords. Now, the grants do ebb and flow in what they cover. So for example, one year we got a lot of neurology studies in one of the bench science categories. And so we populated some more neurologists. And of course, next cycle, we had more oncology than we had oncologists. So unfortunately, that does happen. And we do try to do a keyword matching. But remember that we do have all the expertise on the committee. And so when the primary and secondary reviewer discuss, the other reviewers are reading through it, looking at it, and if they do have expertise, they do speak up about an application. And frankly, while they're live in the meeting, they are, of course, looking at the AIMS page to quickly get familiar with the research. Let's see. Do we need to propose topics that align with reviewers' interests or that of the PhRMA Foundation? So yes, with regard to the interest of the PhRMA Foundation, absolutely. And just a hot tip, we are not afraid of funding what NIH won't fund. We are not afraid of funding what doesn't have a home at the NIH. Half of our reviewers are from industry, and that's really important to understand because they are not afraid at all to fund research that may fail. In fact, they like funding research that may fail in many of our categories, because if you fail and publish, that's fantastic. They don't have to fail and not publish because it's done within an industrial house. So I would just encourage you to look at what we're looking into funding, but then be brave. Don't need to align with the individual reviewers, but you do need to align with what we're asking for. That is important. Love the practicality of this presentation. I typically use objectives to describe how I will achieve an aim instead of aim 1 and 2.
I think you'll hear people say different things. To me, objective sounds a little bit like what you hope to achieve, or to me, it's kind of more of approach.
Yeah.
How I will achieve. So I'm assuming you're talking like you said, here's my aim, and then here's my objective. I think as long as it's clearly laid out that way, I don't think that word in one particular word matters that much. So where else?
Let's see.
We did.
Name, department, and lab details in the aims page. I don't think so. I think that's usually in the letters.
They're going to know where you're from in general. That's one of the things that does get mentioned. But some people do say, like, when you write that specific aims page, do not assume, don't even assume the primary reviewer has read your biosketch or CV. Like, in the body of the text, you can kind of get a little bit more, mention who you are. But I think if you're really a new investigator, you can say, look, I'm at the University of whatever, and I've trained in these 3 areas. Just so they're kind of familiar, but the kind of administrative details you don't need to mention.
So Julia asks, what about citing references in the aims page? She's seen it both ways.
Yeah, I know. I've seen it both ways. No, I'd say no. There's a couple of reasons. One is when they go into the main body of the proposed research, look, those references are all going to be there in the right places. Number 2, probably more importantly to me, that reference draws someone's attention away from that one page. They're not going to go look. I'll tell you right now, they're not going to go look up the reference most likely, but mentally, I feel like it's a little bit of a distraction. You can just say stuff like, a landmark study last year showed that blah, 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 blah. You tell me more about it in the main proposal. You've actually intrigued me, so I wouldn't worry about it.
Good. Somebody's already received a PhRMA grant. Congratulations. And of course, you can apply at every level, pre-doc, postdoc, and early career. We have many of our review committee members, you may or might not know this, have received PhRMA Foundation grants, as well as Dr. Veenstra here, and some of them have received 2. So it is 2 different levels. You cannot receive the same level twice. Let's see. What about figures in the aims? NIH says it's not allowed. We discussed that already, and little figures, well done, targeted are okay, but Dr. Veenstra encouraged it only if you're a little more seasoned in applying for grants, and suggested maybe you shouldn't do it early on.
Yeah, and Wendy mentioned, she says it's not allowed. Okay, so I did it once. We did get funded. It technically might not be allowed. And my general advice, like, certainly read the instructions. I think it's tricky to do it well. I think especially as a young, like, if you've been doing this 10 years, fine, but younger investigator, what I would say, I'm glad you brought this up, because that figure that I know you probably have in your head is super important. That should be the first figure they see in the main text of, let's say, your 12-page proposal, and it should come probably on the first page pretty early on. And generally, these figures people are thinking of are either a conceptual figure about how everything fits together, or it could be some key experimental finding. And so your figures are super important. Put your most important figures up front and early. Do not make them too small. Sacrifice text for figures. Don't make the figures too complex. So that's a whole nother set of tips that maybe another speaker in the future can address, because it's a great topic.
It is a great topic, and we've seen difficult to see figures, and everybody's looking at laptops when they're in our review meeting. So I think you should look at your figures on a laptop if you're putting them anywhere, honestly. Before we end, I want to thank Dr. Veenstra, and I want to reiterate one thing he threw out at the end: follow instructions. We had a very good proposal come in, and the reviewers said this person didn't follow instructions, and then went into detail. Now, sending that back to the applicant was very hard for me. So just do me a favor, don't let that happen. Follow the instructions. For those of you in the value health outcomes space and translational medicine space, we will soon open our application pool for that, and the due date is February 1st. So I know you want to spend your holiday season working on those, and we're going to let you do it. And then we just concluded drug delivery and drug discovery, and so that opens up again in March of 2024. There is a letter of intent phase with that. So we have a whole video on letter of intent phase. You may want to check it out. So thank you to our sponsors. Every single cent sent to us by these wonderful companies is sent back out to you, our award recipients. So without their support, we couldn't do this great work. Thank you, David. Thank you, audience. We are easy to find. Feel free to reach out to any one of us. Take care.